Okay, in this podcast, we're going to learn about aperture and shutter speed, and this is real important stuff. I mean, this is the most basic and fundamental part of learning how to use your camera. And if you can do this, then you can photograph anything. So the first image you see up here is an image of the viewfinder. When you look through your camera, this is what you'll see. And the most important thing to remember, I'm going to talk a lot about how your aperture and shutter speed works, but the most important thing to remember is that when you look through your viewfinder, the meter has to be in the center. That means that you have a properly exposed image. The next image is a close-up of your viewfinder, and at the bottom you can see a little scale. It's got a plus on the left and a minus on the right, and that is a close-up of the meter in your camera. And like I said, the important thing to remember at all times is that when you look through your viewfinder, you see a mark on or near that 0 in the center. It's okay. Notice on this image that there's one little tick mark to the left towards the plus, and that's okay. I mean, if you have 1 or 2, and of course as you move your camera around, that mark is going to change. There's going to be more tick marks under the plus or under the minus depending on how much light is coming through the camera at that point. But the important thing is that you always have that mark on or near the 0. Okay, on the next image you can see the close-up of the viewfinder again, but you notice that there's a lot of tick marks over to the right, way over into the negative area. So when you see something like that, then you know that when you take a shot that the picture is going to be very underexposed. It's going to show up dark. And on this next image you can see them going over to the left, which means that it's going to be very overexposed. It's going to look very bright after you take the picture. So again, that's a good example of something that you don't want to see. You always want to see those tick marks right under the 0. The other thing to notice in that viewfinder is that the numbers at the bottom on the left, the number 125 and the number 5.6, that's your shutter speed and your aperture. So let's talk about these three systems that are used to regulate light in your camera. I just mentioned shutter speed and aperture. The other one is your ISO, which is the sensitivity of the sensor in your camera, and this can change. That's another setting that you have to determine when you're shooting. In the days when we shot film, it was different because when you picked a particular kind of film, it had a film speed, an ISO set to it, so you were stuck with that film speed, for that roll. With digital cameras, you can adjust this sensitivity whenever you want to. But one of the kind of irritating things, I guess you could say, about the photography medium is that most of the systems that you see working seem to kind of be backwards, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. But the ISO system is pretty easy to remember because basically the higher the number of the ISO on your camera, the more sensitive the sensor in your camera is. So in other words, if you're outside in a bright sunny day, you might use an ISO setting of 100 because you already have lots of light coming into the camera. If you're shooting late in the day at dusk or something like that, then you might prefer to use a higher ISO. Most digital SLRs will go up to 800 or even 1200, 1600 ISO. And with this ISO setting, that would be the one setting on your camera that I would say would be okay to use the auto setting. So in other words, as you're out shooting, your camera will automatically adjust the ISO setting that it thinks is probably appropriate for that setting. However, you have to be careful because one of the results of different ISOs is that the lower that ISO number, the sharper your image is going to be. The higher the ISO number is, the more grain or noise you're going to get in your image. And that, if you think about it, that stands to reason. I mean, the sensor essentially has to work harder in order to capture light that's coming into the camera. So the result is you have this artifact of noise that comes into the image. And so there's a couple examples here of an image with more noise and less noise. So now let's go back to aperture and shutter speed and look at that. And let's say that I go outside and I point my camera at the world around me, and my meter, based on the ISO setting that I'm using right now, says that a good exposure is 125 shutter speed and an aperture of 8.0. So the question is, what does that stuff mean? So if you look at all the different shutter speeds that you have on your camera, you see a system of numbers. We were at 125, but if you go different directions, you have 60, 30, 15, 8. You go the other way, it's 250, 500, 1000. And if you look carefully, with a couple of little exceptions, there's a pattern in these numbers. If I go to the higher numbers, I go from 125 to 250, I've doubled that number. If I go from 250 to 500, I've doubled that number again. If I go the other direction, I'm cutting the quantities in half. Of course, with 125 to 60, it's a little bit off, but this system works throughout the shutter speed system, that anytime you go one direction, you're cutting the quantity in half, or if you go the other direction, you're doubling it. However, if you remember earlier, I said that a lot of the systems in photography don't seem to make a lot of sense. When you look at quantities like 250, 500, 1000, it would be easy to assume that those are larger quantities. But in fact, notice on this new slide that these are actually fractions. All these numbers are really 1 over 125 or 1 over 250. So actually 1/250th of a second is a smaller quantity than a 1/25th. So now on this next slide, let's add apertures and look at those in relation to shutter speeds. And notice that the number system really seems to kind of be backwards here. It's pretty rough drawing here of different size apertures, but you get a sense of what I'm talking about, that actually as the number value of an aperture gets smaller, the aperture opening gets bigger. And to try to explain the numerical value there is pretty difficult, so I usually don't do that in a beginning level class. But the important thing to remember is that the aperture system works on the exact same principle as the shutter speed setting. In other words, aperture 8.0 is exactly half the surface area, half the opening of aperture 5.6, and aperture 5.6 is exactly half the opening of aperture 4.0. Same thing if you go the other direction. If I go from 5.6 to 8, it doubles. If I go from 8 to 11, it doubles. So you have the exact same system working here. So you remember in the previous slide, my settings, given the present light conditions, were shutter speed of 125 and an aperture of 8.0. On this slide, the values next to it are circled. I have a shutter speed of 60th of a second and an aperture of 11.0. And now here's a really important thing to remember, and that is that in terms of the total amount of light coming through the camera, both of these settings are identical. And how does that happen? So let's say I go from shutter speed 125 to shutter speed 60. So what's happened? I've doubled the amount of time that the shutter was open. And conversely, I have cut the amount of light in half that came through the shutter. So I doubled one quantity and I halved the other quantity, which in the end makes for the exact same quantity. It's just that the proportions of it have been rearranged a little bit based on aperture and shutter speed. Let's go the other way and say we have a shutter speed of 250 and an aperture of 5.6. I've just decided to go the other direction. I still have the same total quantity of light. It's just that I have a faster shutter speed and a bigger aperture. And probably the obvious question that you're asking yourself at this point is, why do I need to have all these different options? And I'm going to get that in a minute. I'm going to show you several examples of people who have purposely chosen to use a very fast shutter speed or very wide aperture, and the visual results that you get from that. But the really important thing to remember is that every time you go out and shoot, the light's not going to be the same. The one time I went out, I had one set of settings. If I go out at a different time of day, it's going to be brighter, it's going to be darker. So if you look at this slide, I've simply cut the piece of paper in half and slid it, one way, so it gives you different sets of combinations. And that's sort of a visual example of what happens under different lighting conditions. Now, the proper exposure is shutter speed 250 at aperture 11, it means that it's a brighter day. There's more light outside. And that's back to what I was saying before. The very first thing you have to do when you get a meter reading is make sure that that meter is at the 0 mark. So if we're saying that this is our 0 mark, then the next thing that we can do is decide which apertures and which shutter speed combination we want to use. If I slide it the other way, I get a different set of combinations, and that's how your meter is always going to work, depending on the light that's available during the day. You know, to get that 0 mark on your meter, you're going to have different combinations depending on where you go and what time of day. And one little footnote on the whole idea of shutter speeds, and that is that as you get into lower and lower shutter speeds, you notice that you go on the slide that you see now, you go from 8 to 4 to 2, and then the next step is 1, and 1 over 1 is 1. It's a whole second. And then as you continue to go to the left, you're now into whole numbers, 2, 4, 8, 15. Most digital SLRs will go up to a set shutter speed of 30 whole seconds, and then you get a setting called bulb. And with bulb, it's a sort of held over antiquated term from times when cameras were released with a pneumatic bulb that you squeezed. And the idea here is that once you get beyond this 30 whole second as a preset shutter speed, that you can simply hold the shutter button down for an infinite period of time and determine your own shutter speed. And the other thing you notice too, that when I go from fractions to whole numbers, that little inch mark appears next to the number. And that's a real important thing to remember, because some people get confused. They wind up in whole numbers and don't understand why their pictures are so overexposed when they're, when they're thinking that they're in fractions of a second. So just beware of that when you're moving around in your meter.